We're ready to kick off day 2 of the spring 2017 meeting of the National Advisory Committee on Race, Ethnic, and Other Populations. I hope you agree with me that yesterday was very productive. We heard from many different presenters on a variety of topics, and we just started at the end of the day the process for putting together recommendations, and I'm sure we'll spend a lot more time putting together more recommendations. I'm going to remind you that as we have the discussions today, if you have recommendations, send them to the Gmail, the nacchair@gmail.com, so we can put those together. To the audience, if anyone is intending to give public comment today, we ask that you provide your name at the registration desk. I'd also like to welcome 2 new folks to the head table today. We have David Zayaya, who is the Chief Administrative Officer, and we have Burton Rice, who is the Chief of Decennial Communication and Stakeholder Relations, sitting in for Lisa Bloomerman today. So let me just quickly review the agenda. Today, our Vice Chair, Carol Gore, will bring remarks, and following that, Megan Mari, the convener of the Integrated Partnership and Communications Working Group, will offer the working group report. Following Megan, we'll have Jerlene Daniel, convener for the Undercount of Young Children Working Group, who will offer that working group report. After the morning break, Nicholas Jones and Mike Bentley will present the update on the 2015 NCT National Content Test Report. And then after that, the NAC members, we have 2 discussants, Hassan Jabber and Morad Gorban, will present discussion remarks following committee discussion. And we'll stop exactly 11:45 to have the opportunity for public comment. We're then going to have a working lunch, and I think Carol's going to be the moderator for that, correct? Where we'll have more time to do the NAC committee discussion and formulation of recommendations. The committee has requested that we leave early today, so we will adjourn at 2 o'clock instead of 3 o'clock, so we'll have the working lunch straight from 12 to 2. And as for the lunch, we'll be following the same procedures as yesterday. A couple of housekeeping items. We'd like to remind you that if you want to speak, to turn your placard up and wait for the chair to call on you. When you are recognized, please state your name and speak directly into the microphone so we can reflect your comments. And this is needed each time that you want to make a comment. We still have some committee members who need to stop by the registration desk for your packet of travel reimbursement materials, so please try and do that this morning at the break. I understand that I think everyone's going to be riding the bus except for maybe one person who's getting a taxi, so the bus is going to be leaving at 2:15 and it'll go straight to Reagan National Airport. Before you leave, please remember to turn in your badges at the registration desk. And again, just a reminder that the refreshments are provided for committee members only. So with that, I'll turn it over to Vice Chair Carol Gore, who will offer opening remarks.
Did you want to say anything? Just we're going to cover the process. Good morning. Happy Friday. I'll be very, very brief because I know we all want to get out of here at 2 o'clock. A couple things I'm going to mention. So yesterday, I did my best during our presentations to capture recommendations. If it sounded like a recommendation, I tried to capture it. Deedis and I have been talking this morning, and we're going to ask you, when you draft your recommendations, to make them clear, concise, and actionable. So I think that's a good framework for us to consider when drafting our recommendations. We'd also like for you to own them so we know who to talk to about getting the language correct, and if we have questions about what was your point in that recommendation. So for clarity, we want someone to author them. What I did yesterday was I put your name. If I heard you make a recommendation, I put it in the subject line of that email, and I tried to put it by that recommendation, at least try to capture the essence of your recommendation in the subject line. You don't have to be entirely verbose in your recommendations, but it would be nice if you could capture clear, concise, actionable in your verbiage. Tara's going to help put them into what I would call buckets. And what we're suggesting for today is they be put in buckets by the presentation topic. I think that will lead us down the right path. Finally, we've asked Megan to there were a number of recommendations that came out of the presentation yesterday on IPC. So we're going to punt those recommendations to her working group and allow them to reword them, make them clear, concise, actionable. I'm saying this so we all remember. And so we're going to pump those to the working group. We do have some time to get those recommendations in. I think that's a good idea. We'll probably do the same with Jerlene, if there are any recommendations that come out of her presentation on her work group this morning. Other than that, I think that's enough, and we can, yes.
Thanks, Carol. Just a question. Maybe you said this and I didn't understand it properly. So for example, the recommendations that I sent to the NAC chair email address, they're not in the document that was circulated last night, even though I sent them during our meetings yesterday during the daytime. So.
Me too.
Okay, yeah, so I'm not the only one.
They will be. So I
So
worked
they-
with Tara this morning, and she's going to collect all those. If your recommendations were not related to a topic that was on the agenda, we will still collect them, but we'll put them separately, and then we can order them later.
Thank
Does
you
that
for the-
answer your question?
Yes, thank you for
Yes,
the
thank you for bringing that
clarification.
up. Okay. Any other questions? Great, thank you.
Thank you, Carol. So now presenting is Megan Maury, the convener of the Integrated Partnership and Communications Working Group, and we'll have a brief discussion.
Good morning, y'all. I know it's super early. Super appreciate you having your eyes open at 8:40 in the morning. I'm going to get us right, not just back on time, but early on our schedule because I have very little to say. I've been chairing the Integrated Partnerships and Communications Working Group. You heard a presentation yesterday on that IPC work, and it actually pretty clearly laid out for you what our next steps are as a working group. So I just want to remind people where we're going and invite the new folks on the committee to please feel free to join our working group. We've got a bit of a different structure than the other working groups, so it may be something that you want to be a part of. So the IPC working group, unlike other working groups, is a long-range working group. It will act through and even beyond the 2020 census, whereas the other working groups tend to take a topic, do a deep dive on it, and then sort of disband, right? The IPC working group has a series of checkpoints where the Census Bureau will say, hey, we have this document coming out, like, for example, the Integrated Partnerships and Communications Plan that's coming out this summer. We'd like to hear your feedback on it. So we convene at the moments when those checkpoints are coming up and give feedback, but we continually meet throughout many, many years instead of having sort of a few months where we're meeting all the time and deep diving. So our next checkpoint, again, is around that plan. That'll happen this summer. I think a lot of folks on this, on the NAC would like to have something to say about that plan. So even if you haven't been part of the working group before and you want to participate in our dive on that plan, please feel free to join us. We'd love to have you. So either let me know or let Tara know. We can add you to the list for those meetings around the plan. And don't feel like that commits you to meet with us for the next 5 years. Thanks so much, y'all.
Thank you, Megan. So now we'll turn it over to Jerlene Daniel, who is the convener on the Undercount of Young Children Working Group report, and they'll talk about what they've been working on.
Thank you. Having arrived in the nick of time. All right. You have, I believe, a PowerPoint that is really kind of just the basics. We do have a couple of recommendations that we'd like to put forward that I need to wordsmith a bit, but when we get ready to have that conversation. All right, so first of all, I thought I would remind folks of what the issues are related to the undercount of young children. And we're talking, when we say young children, we're talking birth to 5. And for a number of years, across several censuses, there's been an undercount of young children in that age bracket. And that number, the problem of the overcount is growing. And so, for example, in 2010, the estimate of the undercount is anywhere between 4.6% and 10.3%, or as you can see, 970,000 children versus just over 2 million children. And it depends on, I think, as the Census Department, Census Bureau itself is looking at how they count, what their processes and procedures are, they've determined that, did we miss these children because we missed the household? Did we miss it because people were confused? And so as they're trying to better define the errors that may have been made in past years so as to be able to correct them, you have this kind of range, but they're working to clean that up. The coverage of young children varies by race and Hispanic origin, and that is to say that more young children who are Black or Hispanic are undercounted than others. Complex household structures really impact the undercount. One of the things you received yesterday was a copy of a PowerPoint by Linda Jacobson, who is a demographer. The PowerPoint you got was a presentation she did for one of our conference call meetings. And if you happen to have that in front of you, and maybe you don't, but if you do, the third to last slide shows a picture of, it's entitled Classification of Cohabiting Couple Households and Children. And I think a lot of us know intellectually that people have different partners, they change partners, they live together. We just kind of know that in a way abstractly, even though we may know a few people this is true of. But we found that as far as the census is concerned, if you look at that diagram, and what that diagram does is it suggests, well, what if person number one is considered to be the head of household? What does that mean in terms of the child and whomever her partner might be? The next says, well, what if the child, let's see, it's the head of household's own child, but she's with an unmarried partner. You can't make assumptions about who the child's father is. Does that make sense? And then the third example is, what if there's an unrelated child in the household, and it's a non-family member who's the head of the household. Now, again, you can't make assumptions about relationships. And some of us, in our early conversations, were perturbed by the terminology complex households. But graphs like this, we haven't come up with a better word. So it's like, okay, it is indeed complex. But it does point to and help us begin to understand some of the issues behind the undercount. If you're an unrelated person and you may not know much about that child, even though they're living at the household, you may leave them off, you may not know important information about them, and so this is all part of the work that Census has to do to nail down the issue of the undercount and be able to give a more accurate count. It is indeed very complex. Let's see. So one of the things that we had hoped to do was to help with the questions that Census might ask of the household head so that children would be counted. And we had hoped to do that in terms of 2020. But clearly, it is too late to impact the questions on 2020. And so we are feeling as though our work in combination with the subject matter experts at Census will be aiding with 2030. And I realize that sounds a really long way off to you, but it'll be here before we know it. We're going to be able, we think, to have much more impact on something like the American Community Survey, questions that might relate to that. The clock has not run out on us in terms of that. And so we will be working with Census staff as they do their research and raise questions to make recommendations around that. You also have in front of you a sheet that was probably just put there this morning. It's a grid. We had asked Census staff to give us some sense of the timing as relates to the 2020 census, as to when we could have input. And this is really confirmation that it's late regarding the questions and that need to go on the 2020 census. You see March 2018 when the questions would have been finalized and so forth. But remember that any question we'd like Census to ask, they need to do some research on that question. They do focus groups, they really dig in, and they don't have time to do any of that. But again, around ACS and so forth, we can no doubt have some impact. I'd like to also call your attention to the third line of the grid that talks about the residency rules. And given the diagram I just referred to related to cohabiting, you can see that some kind of publicity around the census's residency rules would be helpful in terms of people answering, the heads of household being able to answer questions accurately about who's in the house, right? And as I read the residency rules, and please, I know Census will correct me if I'm misstating this, but it seems to boil down to who is sleeping overnight in your home on April 1st. And so you think about couples that may be sharing custody. On April 1st, where is the child? And this gets to being able to count everybody, count them once, and get it right. So we're thinking that as those residency rules are finalized, and there are things that the communication folks can do with that. Let's see. All right, so that's enough of that. Let me run through the rest of this right quick, just to remind you what our deliverables are. One was, as I've been thinking, we're supposed to review the literature, understand the demographic data, the collection practices, and we're in the process of doing that. But what I would say to you is that Census, as I mentioned, is also in the process of uncovering the issues related to the undercount. And so we were, all right, so that's one of our deliverables. The other was around making recommendations about data collection, methods, and outreach to groups. How are you going to outreach to groups? And that we feel like we can clearly have some impact on. The Y&R team, the communications team, is going to be, their plan will be ready, I understand, in about June. And we have been assured that we will have a chance to talk with them and give some feedback on that plan, and we are looking forward to that. So far we've had 4 conference calls, 2 face-to-face meetings. We've reviewed some of the work that the Census has done, and we've talked to some outside subject matter experts. What's next? I think I did that in the beginning. This is why I hate PowerPoint. I always start at the end. So ignore this page. We do have, as I said, some recommendations that we'd like to put forward. So now I'd like to throw it open to the floor, and if people have questions or comments, please do.
So let me jump in first. So this phenomena is not new. So if you really look at it, it started in at least the 1990 census, where we measured that we missed, with both our coverage measurement survey and demographic analysis techniques, that we missed a significant number of children ages 0 to 5. It was also the case in 2000 and 2010. The interesting thing in 2000 and 2010, I think Pat would correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe the coverage measurement survey measured a huge undercount of children in that age group. Pat's nodding, which has some unique properties. It means that this is a very, very hard, they're hard to, there's some kind of correlation going on with their probability of being included in either a census or a survey, which in a sense means they're very hard to capture. My experience has been that on a mail-out, mail-back enterprise like the decennial census, questions don't work. They just get lost and everything else. We've done a census with questions, we've done a census without questions, and the coverage hasn't changed. So I don't think that's the vehicle. But I do think that if you really want to do it, you have to somehow find a way to reach specific households and make some inroads with those households or people that actually have the children. You have to really get to them. And that says you can either do it through some kind of targeted advertising, right? I'm not giving up for 2020 yet. So with some kind of targeted advertising, some kind of targeted communication campaign, or you can identify some households with using some administrative records or other materials and say these households have a high chance of having the potential to have children, and then go back and re-interview those households to see if they do have children. I mean, we're not talking about a huge number of households. I think if we re-interviewed a couple million households, which in the grand scheme of the census isn't big, we could, and they were the right households, we could make big inroads into this population. But I would like the committee not to think about questions that would go on the general census, because I don't think that's a fruitful way to progress. I think that you want to think about how do we target, how do we identify these households, and then how do we communicate to them. I really would advocate for that a great deal.
All right, and the outreach piece of it is what we're feeling like, where we can make the most inroads.
Yeah.
And so, for example, one of the recommendations we would like to submit ask that when you look at the array of supports around the 2020 census, such as communications and partnership agreements and so on, that in each of those cases, there be designated somebody who is accountable to make sure that the issue of the undercount, that counting young children and the people in their lives. We thought about, young children and young mothers, but as Arturo very scientifically pointed out to us, they don't get here without dads as well. So that's why we say young children and the people in their lives. So somebody's designated to make sure that the issue is covered and that there's some targeting of that issue. So I'll stop now, and if other members of the work group would like to comment, or other members of the NAC. Yes.
Luke, and then Macon.
Hi, good morning, and thanks, Jerry, for the presentation. Director, you're absolutely right. We need to look at our outreach strategy, but I think part of the outreach strategy is clearly defining certain terms so that we know what households we're talking about, and I think Dita said it yesterday. Some jurisdictions have group homes and group quarters, and what does that mean in each state? And even with fostering, what does that mean in each family? So, and we were speaking about this morning, depending culturally, you may have oversight on a child, but it may not be legal fostering. And so when we're asking those questions or when we're communicating and reaching out, we need to clearly define so that there's one uniform definition when we're going into these households.
Macon, and then Yolande.
I beg to differ on the father piece, but that's another, that's not actually my comment. I know tons of families with no father. Anyway, irrelevant. The two things sort of sprang to mind for me when you were giving this presentation, and thank you so much, it's so interesting to me. I wish I could be on every working group, but capacity. But my big question was how you're thinking about housing instability, not homelessness. I think when it comes to homelessness, I feel like lots of people are being captured, and that have families with young children, lots of people are being captured in group quarters, and that's one thing. But we also know that having young children in the home is a huge predictor for housing instability. And I'm not talking the kind of housing instability where you live somewhere for a year and then move to another apartment. I'm talking about the kind of housing instability where you may be in a different household every 2 weeks, where you're being evicted on a regular basis. There are stats from cities where folks get evicted, upwards of 15 to 20 times in a year. So that's like, one chunk. There's also a lot of folks who end up kind of, when I was a kid, we would have called it couch surfing, but when you're talking about families with young children, it's staying with family members regularly. So that feeling of where you slept on April 1st may be a different, there may be a different sense to it when you're talking about housing instability. So I'd love to think about how you all are thinking about that.
I think that's why the dovetailing of what do you mean by a resident and where, that, but the terminology of housing instability is really helpful.
Yeah,
Thinking about that.
I have an awesome book for you if you feel like reading something on it. The other piece was just a technical question around the American Community Survey with, do you have thoughts in your mind of what additional questions might be that would help you uncover this? Are you already thinking about that? Is there any more information you can provide on that, or you're not there yet?
We're not there yet.
Okay, cool, that's it. Thank you. And I would love to collaborate between our working groups, communications and young children.
I'm not sure who was first. Did you see who came up?
So it's Yolande, Charlie, then Arturo, Alisu.
We also discussed the issue of grandparents and public housing where grandparents may be illegally, according to the lease agreement, having their kids, their grandchildren, because the daughter or the mother may be drug addicted. So we discussed this morning at breakfast meeting how we are going to reach out and capture this group of persons who may be housing their kids or grandchildren or raising them at various points around, how are we going to capture this group as well? Because technically, they can't be on the lease because they are senior citizens.
Charlie?
I really appreciate your comments and know that a lot of work is going on in the census around this. In terms of communication strategies, I think that, and I know you're developing and testing and working with communications entities at this point in time. I think something specifically on why young kids need to be counted and to get a good statement that can go out so that the people who have young kids or are in households where there are young kids who may not be theirs really do that. And I would really suggest that may be a good overall messaging theme that would improve the count generally. Leading with kids I always think is a good idea and can potentially get, because I know there's reticence about responding to the census. But I think that there's part of an overall communications plan and then part of targeted messages for use with both people with particular contact with young children, as I think you look at partnerships, and also geographic areas where we know there's a big undercount. And what we have is we know there's an undercount among racial groups, we know there's an undercount among complex families, and we know there's an undercount generally among people who are struggling to get by and in poverty. And we know that those are geographically concentrated in certain areas. And so I think that there's a reason for doing that communication. So I think one of the things, hope that the census will do, and maybe we'll formulate recommendations on, is around messages specifically designed for making the case for why we need to get all young kids or all kids counted, and to look at those both for targeted use and for overall use by the census. And then working within the federal offices in terms of partnerships for those with the most contact with people. And we talked a lot in our group around the foster care population, which I think is an area of high potential undercount. It's not going to get you to the 4.6% of the kids. It's only 7.7% of the population, but it's an area of undercount, and to look very proactively around that, around McVie and MCHB and some other organizations which really serve this population. WIC serves 35% of all 0 to 3-year-olds in the country, and they have tremendous penetration rate in this population, so how can we make use of that? And then working with a lot of the associations and organizations which have contact, and really with a recognition of what their bandwidth is and what resources they can bring to bear to make it as easy as possible for their use. So and I think you're probably doing a lot of these things, and we just want to be involved and reinforce that activity and provide additional assistance in doing some of the outreach that may not be, you may not have necessarily reviewed or thought about.
Arturo?
So this will just be underscoring what already has been said. And Mr. Director, in fact, you are adding a question to the process on this already. As we were showed yesterday in the demonstration, on the online form, people are prompted at the end of the form, did you miss anybody? Didn't you include all children? So there are questions on the form, so thank you for that. But what we're saying is that, yes, this is not a new issue.
Arturo, I'm not saying not to ask the questions. I'm just saying that they're
No,
not.
no, I get it.
Not,
No.
they haven't been the answer in the past, and so.
I understand that,
I
but
wouldn't count on them.
the way you approach households is part of this resolution. And it's not a new issue, so what we're saying is, so therefore, we can't do business as usual. If we want to perfect the count, we have to get at this particular issue. If we want to correct the undercount specific of the Latino community, we need to get at this issue. If 400,000 Latino young children were missed, unless we get at this issue, we're not going to have a good count of Latinos, period. So the suggestions that we're making here is that we want to see institutionalized in all components of the decennial and the ACS strategies that specifically look at the counting of young children in everything that is done in the enumeration process. The training of enumerators, the field staff, the partnership program, the communications program, all the consultants that are being hired, everybody should have a lens that is required for them to use to see how is this component of the enumeration going to get at the undercount of these children. And that's, I think, the recommendations that we will be developing. Because, we're with you. We want to have the best census possible, and so we got to get at this particular issue in order to achieve that.
Thank you, Arturo. If I could just make a comment. I'm always really pleased to hear the data, to hear the problems, and I take it back to where I'm at. And so, because I can control this part of it, I am going to make sure that California, as a huge state, actually has, I'm not going to call it a czar, but somebody who focuses specifically on the count of children 0 to 5. And so, and also even when I think about the schools based outreach that we do, the robocall scripts that we give to all the principals, we'll put a line in there saying, although your child that, I'm talking about is in school, don't forget about their siblings. So, but I want to have somebody specifically, and Arturo, I know you know a lot of folks in California, someone that I can say, okay, you're in charge of, on my committee to make sure that they're always remembered across whatever we do throughout our complete count efforts throughout the state. So that's something that I can commit to, and I would say if you have impact in your local areas, to also make, we're asking the Census Bureau to say, make all the areas of the decennial focus on that, also make your local folks, state folks focus on it as well.
So a great suggestion would be, as the Census Bureau's partnership program sets up its complete count committees, the Bureau should be working with each state and each locality to say, you should have somebody who's your point person specifically on this population, for example.
Yes, I like that. Also, it needs to be data-based, and so I'm working with our state demographers to get better targeted data of where are these folks in California, and how can we target them better? How can we target them, interview, what are the different processes, not necessarily just questions, what are all the venues that we can get in touch and communicate with them? So, thank you. I have Alisu, and then Julie, and then Kristen.
Good morning. Just adding to what Charles and Arturo have said, the message about the very young children also need to be counted is, of course, very important. But I think we also have to remember that when we, target, and I know, the contractors have been selected to be culturally sensitive, but there are some elements like the discomfort that, for instance, a lot of Latino families feel about reporting about others in the household, in complex households where they're not all related. That gets even more so when they have to talk about children, somebody else's child. And so, those, to be very aware of those cultural factors that are going to make someone less likely to report about others that are unrelated in the household and their children in particular. In testing census forms, sometimes, I've run into like a grandfather not reporting the grandbaby, and upon probing, the person saying, "Oh, but she's just so tender." So there's this idea that the little ones, they're just not to be counted. There's also the assumptions that people make about when a child stays part of the time in one place and part of the time in the other place, and people assume that they'll be counted elsewhere. And that ought to be another important message in the communications campaign. If you're in doubt, talk with the other household if that's something that's a possibility, or report them. The census form is designed to accommodate information about people living in more than one place, and Census has procedures to deduplicate if there are potential duplicates. That is easier to resolve than undercounting. Thank you.
Julie?
This comment's coming a little late because it's from earlier, but I'm just not the all children have fathers thing, or all children even have mothers thing. This really bothers me, and Megan tried to sort of allude to it briefly before moving on to her point, but I just want to make this a real point here. We're wanting to get complex, understand the evolution of the family. There are kids who don't have fathers. There are kids who don't have mothers. They are adopted by two gay men. Let's not, in our conversation here, forget queer families or single parent families where the woman basically decides to have a child on her own through a donor, IVF, or adoption, and the child doesn't have a father or the child doesn't have a mother. And so I just think even all of our language and having conversations about families, we need to be cognizant of that, basically. Families are changing. There are individuals who don't have fathers or mothers, basically, and we need to be aware of that in all of our language and our communications with the public.
Julie, can I just add,
Okay,
since I'm the one who made the comment this morning, my specific language was young children and the people in their lives. Okay? Well, no, that's where that comment then evolved from. So
And
I'm
if-
really talking about everybody who is involved in the life of a child. Those are the people we need to reach, as complex the households and families are, and sometimes unrelated families, members. You know, family doesn't mean biological. So children and the people in their lives.
Okay, and let me just clarify. What I was referring to is the connection between a sperm and an egg, not whom, that we can't leave out. It really goes back to all the people in the child's life, but the notion that you can't leave out, all these folks. But I appreciate your clarification. Thank you.
So I have Kirsten, Gilberto, and then Yolande.
This is just short. Jolene in the working group, I realized when you were talking about housing instability, perhaps due to addicted parents, that there's been a shift since 2010. I'll just say addiction afflicts every community equally. I'm just going to say it's evenly distributed. But debilitating addiction, where your children are taken away from you, has hit new areas of the country with the opioid addiction. And so it could be that some of the housing instability, that the pockets of housing instability from 2010, the pattern across the United States, it might not only shift but have grown into new areas that we wouldn't have normally thought of housing instability. That's just because the debilitating addiction where you're non-functional anymore is reaching new places, if that makes sense. And that's something that the Y&R could figure out. I mean, you just have to look at hospitalizations for overdoses. I mean, you could see the patterns of where opioid types addictions are worse, and you're going to find more housing instability there. Just a thought.
Gilberto, and then Yolande.
Good morning. Throughout these discussions, we see the importance of partnerships and communications. So I'm wondering if within NAC we have a group that is working with the Census people in the area of strengthening these partnerships and communication, so we can work closely with these organizations that are present in specific communities that we want to reach and improve the results of the census.
Thanks, Gilberto. I'd really like to see when we hear from our contractors what their specific plan on the specific issue. So, Yolande?
I just wanted to raise the issue of the necessity and some of the Hispanic communities, you might need interpreters. When we were doing some research in New Jersey, we actually had to hire Hispanic interpreters to go in some of these homes to administer the questionnaire because of the cultural differences. And we got much better return rate when we sent Hispanics into the communities, especially the recent immigrant communities. And we had to pay particular attention to the way we asked the question as well. That was a critical issue.
So I just wanted to actually loop back around to Kirsten's comment, which it just gave me the idea that that's, like in California, I don't know if we engaged our DSS or our drug and rehab programs, and we may have, but we may not have given them a separate message about, and if you have children, make sure, and because they may not be with them, right? Make sure that they get counted too. So I thank you for that comment. Luke?
So as the conversations were going on, I started thinking about in New York, one of the things, and several jurisdictions are doing this, our strategy on targeting unsafe sleeping practices. And that's been one of our struggles. How do we reach out to teen moms, English as a second language parents, et cetera. And what we found was we would be more effective if we partnered with hospitals from the beginning, where the doctors, the clinical staff who interact with these parents, the doulas, the midwives in the communities who interact with these families, to kind of give them the education beforehand that, this is why it's important to have safe sleeping practices in your home. So I'm thinking in the same lines with what Charles mentioned earlier, when we explain the importance of being counted in the census, how it impacts, the public assistance dollars or federal dollars that your locality can have, I think that's a great grassroots area to target: the hospitals, the social services agencies in each state, even I guess the vital stats offices in each jurisdiction who will count those numbers for birth certificates, et cetera. So I think if we can use our or have our contractors really make that connection on a local level, would be very impactful, especially at the hospitals.
Just to follow up on what Luke is saying, that's very important because those organizations have a lot of information on these communities that we can benefit from.
So that just reminds me, I just developed a partnership with the California Medical Association, which represents all the doctors. And they're actually, even though you think doctors, they've got it developed to where they're almost like union communication they push out. But also, I've thought, well, I didn't think about developing, I used to work at the California Hospital Association, but hospitals as well to reach all of that. So those are, for me, and I've done this, unlikely partnerships that I'm going to start really early on, focused on this specific issue. So I appreciate both of those comments. Charlene?
Okay, I just want to kind of to round out our report, this last slide that says that the Census Bureau has done its part to formalize the initiative around the undercount of young children by naming a leadership team in Scott Konicki and Gina Oleko. And so we're really delighted with that, because that formal accountability will move the issue further along.
All right, any other comments, or Julene, you want to just close? Is that your? Awesome. Okay, so we are probably heading for a break if there's not any other.
Yeah, we were scheduled to have a break, and I think our next presenter is not until 9:40. So we'll see if we can get him down here a little bit early. So why don't we take a 10-minute break?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.